King George II of Great Britain died on a toilet, and his royal physician documented every brutal detail of what killed him. The 76-year-old monarch sat down on his chamber pot one October morning in 1760, began straining to relieve himself, and within minutes collapsed dead on the floor while his valet listened from outside the door. The autopsy revealed a cardiovascular system torn apart by something as mundane as a bowel movement, and the medical report would become famous as the first detailed documentation of how straining too hard can literally explode your arteries from the inside out. George II spent 33 years ruling England while never quite figuring out how to stop being an angry German who screamed at people in broken English and preferred his homeland to the kingdom he was supposed to govern. Born in Hanover in 1683, he grew up watching his parents destroy their marriage through mutual hatred until his father locked his mother in a castle prison for the rest of her life, which gives you some context for why George developed emotional issues that manifested as volcanic rage. When his father became King George I of England in 1714, the whole Hanover family moved to London to rule a country that deeply resented being governed by Germans who could barely speak the language and made no effort to hide their contempt for English customs. Young George became Prince of Wales and immediately started feuding with his father so viciously that they held rival courts and could barely stand to be in the same palace, with the old king at one point literally putting his son under house arrest because their relationship had become that toxic. Historical records describe George as short and stocky with bulging blue eyes and a prominent nose, prone to rage fits where he'd kick his wit around the room while cursing in German accented English that his courtiers learned to fear. He spoke with a thick accent his entire life and famously declared he hated poets and painters, considering cultural refinements pointless compared to military matters, which tells you exactly what kind of man he was. But George had one redeeming quality that saved him from being completely insufferable, which was his genuine love for his wife Caroline of Ansbach, a brilliant woman who could actually manage his temper and guide his political decisions when he'd listen to her. She was the stabilizing force in his chaotic personality, the person who could talk him down from his rages and convince him to make sensible choices rather than just screaming at problems until they went away. When Caroline died in 1737 after a botched surgery for an umbilical hernia, George was genuinely devastated, weeping openly and declaring he would never remarry but only take mistresses, which was perhaps the most romantic thing this hot-tempered German king ever said. Her death marked a turning point because George lost the one person who could manage him, and he became even more rigid and difficult as he aged. He also started an absolutely vicious feud with his eldest son Frederick, replicating the same toxic father-son dynamic that had poisoned his relationship with his own father, and when Frederick died unexpectedly in 1751, George's main reaction seemed to be relief that he wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. By his 70s, George had transformed into a man who demanded absolute routine and predictability in every aspect of his life, doing everything at exactly the same time each day because any disruption triggered anxiety or rage that his aging body and mind couldn't handle. This obsessive need for control extended to every detail of his existence, from when he woke up to when he ate meals to when he sat on his closed stool each morning to handle his increasingly problematic bowel movements, following the same ritual day after day while his digestive system slowly failed him. The years of rigid routine and poor diet were taking their toll on George's body in ways he probably didn't fully understand, because 18th-century medicine had essentially no concept of how lifestyle choices affected long-term health or why some people developed chronic constipation while others didn't. The typical aristocratic diet of the era was a gastrointestinal nightmare, consisting primarily of multiple courses of roasted meats, rich sauces, creamy desserts, and enough wine to float a ship, while fresh vegetables were considered peasant food that refined people avoided. George would have been eating meals that sat in his stomach like lead weights, providing almost no fiber to stimulate healthy bowel movements and forcing his intestines to work overtime just to process the constant influx of heavy, difficult-to-digest food. The royal lifestyle also meant very little physical exercise compared to common people who worked with their bodies daily, with George spending most of his time sitting in council meetings or riding in carriages rather than walking or performing any kind of manual labor that might have kept his digestive system functioning properly. As he aged, the natural weakening of intestinal muscles combined with his sedentary lifestyle and terrible diet to create progressively worsening constipation, where bowel movements that had once happened naturally now required significant physical effort and straining. By the time he reached his mid-70s, George was probably spending considerable time each morning on his closed stool, pushing harder and harder just to achieve what his body used to do automatically, unaware that every straining episode was damaging his cardiovascular system in ways that would eventually prove fatal. Every morning when George sat on his closed stool and strained to move his stubborn bowels, he was conducting a brutal stress test on blood vessels that were already weakening from 7 decades of wear and probably undiagnosed high blood pressure. The human aorta is the body's main artery, a massive vessel about the diameter of a garden hose that carries oxygenated blood directly from the heart to the rest of the body, and it has to withstand enormous pressure with every heartbeat while maintaining flexibility and structural integrity. In a healthy young person, the aortic walls are strong and elastic, able to handle normal blood pressure fluctuations without sustaining damage, but as people age those walls gradually stiffen and develop microscopic weak spots where the tissue has degraded from decades of constant pressure and mechanical stress. George's aorta had been bearing the load for 76 years, and if he had high blood pressure, which many people develop as they age without realizing it, his arterial walls were being subjected to excessive force every single day, slowly developing the kind of structural damage that wouldn't show symptoms until catastrophic failure occurred. The real danger came from what happened inside his body when he bore down and pushed during a bowel movement, because that action creates what modern medicine calls the Valsalva maneuver, a sudden massive spike in internal pressure that slams blood through your cardiovascular system with violent intensity. When you hold your breath and contract your abdominal muscles to force out a stubborn bowel movement, you're essentially turning your torso into a pressure chamber where the force has to go somewhere, and where it goes is through your blood vessels. Your blood pressure can spike by 50 points or more in a matter of seconds during aggressive straining, sending shockwaves through arterial walls that might already be compromised by age or disease. For someone with a healthy aorta, occasional straining probably won't cause immediate problems, but for someone like George who had been doing this daily for years while his arterial walls slowly degraded, each straining episode was adding more microscopic damage to tissue that was already dangerously weakened. The aorta's inner layer, called the intima, is particularly vulnerable to this kind of repetitive stress because it's in direct contact with the blood flow and has to absorb the impact of every pressure surge. Over time, the intima can develop small tears and weak spots that don't cause obvious symptoms but represent structural failures waiting to become catastrophic failures when the next big pressure spike hits. George's physicians in 1760 had absolutely no way to detect this progressive damage because they didn't have blood pressure cuffs, imaging technology, or even a basic understanding of how cardiovascular disease develops over decades rather than appearing suddenly. They could see that elderly patients who strained excessively on the toilet sometimes dropped dead without warning, but they attributed it to divine providence or bad humors rather than recognizing the mechanical connection between straining and vascular failure. George himself probably experienced warning signs that his aorta was in trouble, things like chest discomfort or unusual fatigue during physical exertion, but he would have dismissed these symptoms as normal aging rather than red flags indicating serious cardiovascular disease that was progressing toward a deadly conclusion. The chronic constipation that forced George to strain so aggressively was itself a product of multiple factors that had been accumulating throughout his life and worsening as he aged into his 70s. His diet was fundamentally incompatible with healthy digestion, lacking the fiber that stimulates intestinal contractions and softens stool to make it easier to pass, which meant his colon had to work much harder than it should have to process waste through his system. The lack of physical exercise meant his entire body was operating in a sluggish state, with reduced muscle tone extending to the smooth muscles of his intestines that were responsible for moving waste along through peristaltic contractions. As people age, those intestinal muscles naturally lose strength and the nerves that control them become less responsive, making the whole digestive process slower and less efficient, and by 76 George's colon was probably operating at a fraction of its youthful capacity. 18th-century medicine had essentially nothing useful to offer for chronic constipation beyond aggressive laxatives that often made the problem worse by irritating the bowels and causing cramping without actually addressing the underlying causes. George might have been taking various purges and enemas that provided temporary relief followed by rebound constipation as his system recovered from the chemical assault, creating a vicious cycle where each intervention made his baseline condition worse. The end result was a king who spent increasing amounts of time each morning straining on his closed stool, pushing with greater force to overcome bowels that were becoming progressively more resistant to cooperation, all while his weakened aorta accumulated more damage with every episode until the inevitable happened and the vessel simply couldn't take any more stress. The morning started like every other morning in George's rigidly structured life, with the king waking at his usual time and preparing to follow the daily routine that gave him comfort and predictability in an uncertain world. At some point in the early morning hours, George made his way to the small private closet off his bedroom where his closed stool waited, that wooden chair with a chamber pot underneath that represented the height of 18th-century bathroom technology for the wealthy. The closed stool sat in a space that afforded at least some privacy, though the concept of true privacy for royalty was always somewhat theoretical given the constant presence of servants and attendants who were never far from the king's person. George's valet waited respectfully outside the closet door, ready to assist if needed but otherwise giving the monarch the illusion of solitude during this most personal of bodily functions, probably thinking about nothing more serious than what breakfast would be served or what the day's schedule held. Inside the closet, George lowered himself onto the closed stool and began the process of trying to move bowels that had grown increasingly uncooperative with age and poor diet. He bore down and pushed, contracting his abdominal muscles and holding his breath to generate the internal pressure needed to force out stubborn waste, performing the Valsalva maneuver that he'd probably done thousands of times before without incident. But this morning was different because this morning the cumulative damage to his aorta reached its breaking point, and when the pressure spike hit, the weakened inner wall of the artery simply tore apart. The intima ripped along its length, creating what modern medicine calls an aortic dissection, where blood surges into the space between the arterial layers and creates a false channel that can propagate along the entire length of the vessel in a matter of seconds. Blood immediately began flooding into the space between the layers of George's aorta and also burst through into the pericardial sac surrounding his heart, filling that protective membrane with fluid that prevented the heart from expanding properly to pump blood. The sensation would have been intensely painful, a massive tearing feeling in his chest like being stabbed from the inside, followed almost immediately by the symptoms of cardiovascular shock as his blood pressure crashed and his brain was suddenly starved of the oxygen-rich blood it needed to function. George probably tried to cry out or stand up, some instinctive reaction to the crisis overwhelming his body, but his muscles weren't receiving proper signals anymore and his vision was already darkening as consciousness slipped away. He collapsed forward off the closed stool, his body hitting the floor hard enough to create a wound on his temple where he struck something during the fall, and lay there barely breathing while his circulatory system failed in spectacular fashion. The valet outside heard the crash, that unmistakable sound of a heavy body hitting the ground, and came running into the closet where he found King George II sprawled unconscious on the floor with blood beginning to pool beneath his head from the scalp wound. The servant's training kicked in and he screamed for help, bringing other attendants running from elsewhere in the palace, and within moments they were lifting the king's limp body and carrying him to his bed while someone was sent to fetch the royal physicians, though everyone in that room probably understood on some level that no doctor could save a man who looked the way George looked in that moment. They settled the unconscious king on his mattress and tried to make him comfortable, which was really all they could do given that 18th-century medicine had no concept of how to treat massive internal bleeding or cardiovascular collapse. Princess Amelia was summoned to come to her father's bedside because when kings are dying their family needs to be present for the final moments and the transfer of power that must happen immediately afterward, but she was too slow getting there because George's body wasn't interested in waiting for emotional farewells. His heart struggled to beat without proper blood pressure, his lungs couldn't oxygenate blood that wasn't circulating effectively, and his brain was shutting down from oxygen deprivation, all the body's systems failing in a cascading collapse that modern emergency medicine might have been able to slow but could never have reversed once the aortic dissection reached this stage. George II died in his bed within minutes of collapsing, his heart giving a few final weak contractions before stopping entirely, ending 33 years of rule and 76 years of life in the most undignified way imaginable for a monarch who'd spent decades trying to maintain absolute control over every aspect of his existence. The king who'd commanded armies and ruled an empire had been defeated by his own intestines and cardiovascular system, killed by the simple biological act of trying to take a shit, which would become the defining fact of his historical legacy regardless of anything else he'd accomplished during his reign. The next morning, October 26, royal physician Frank Nichols arrived at Kensington Palace with 2 sergeant surgeons to perform the official autopsy that would determine exactly what had killed the king so suddenly and violently. Nichols was no ordinary doctor but rather a distinguished anatomist who'd been studying blood vessels and cardiovascular disease for decades, having presented papers to the Royal Society about aneurysms as far back as 1728, so when he opened George's chest cavity he knew he was looking at something medically significant. The aorta showed massive trauma, with the inner layers torn apart along a significant length of the vessel, creating the false channel through which blood had surged during the king's final moments. The pericardial sac around the heart was filled with blood that had leaked from the damaged aorta, creating cardiac tamponade where the heart essentially drowns in fluid and cannot expand to beat properly. But Nichols also found something even more dramatic, which was that George's right ventricle had actually ruptured, with a tear in the muscular wall that had allowed blood to pour into the chest cavity. Modern cardiovascular specialists looking at Nichols' report would immediately understand the sequence of events, because aortic dissection can absolutely trigger the cascade of failures he documented. The dissection happened first, triggered by the massive pressure spike when George strained on the toilet, ripping open the weakened inner layers of his aorta and allowing blood to surge into the space between the arterial walls. That dissection then compressed the pulmonary artery, the vessel carrying blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, creating a blockage that caused pressure to build rapidly in the right chamber of the heart. The ventricle wall, subjected to this sudden massive increase in pressure, simply burst like an overinflated balloon, tearing open and spilling blood throughout the chest. This secondary failure would have guaranteed George's death even if the aortic dissection alone hadn't been immediately fatal, because once your heart's chambers are ruptured there's no coming back from that even with modern surgical techniques. Nichols documented everything with meticulous care, measuring the extent of the damage and recording the condition of other organs to build a complete picture of what had happened inside the king's body. He noted that George's other organs showed the expected signs of aging but nothing that would have killed him on its own, making it clear that the cardiovascular failure was the sole cause of death and that it had happened catastrophically fast, giving the king no chance of survival once the aorta tore. The physician theorized correctly that the trigger had been straining during defecation, recognizing that the Valsalva maneuver created exactly the kind of pressure surge that could tear apart a weakened aorta, though he didn't have the modern medical terminology to describe the mechanics in the detail we'd use today. Nichols took his findings and wrote them up in a formal report that he submitted to the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which published it in 1761 under the title that essentially translated to an account of the king's sudden death. The paper provided the first detailed English-language description of aortic dissection, explaining how the inner arterial layers could separate from the outer layers and create a false channel that disrupted normal blood flow and could lead to catastrophic failure of the heart. Modern doctors still reference this autopsy as a landmark case in cardiovascular medicine because Nichols' careful observations documented the connection between straining and vascular rupture in a way that couldn't be dismissed or ignored, providing evidence that something as mundane as a difficult bowel movement could trigger lethal consequences for people with compromised arteries. The report also helped establish the principle that autopsies should be conducted on important figures who died suddenly, because understanding the medical cause of death served the advancement of scientific knowledge even when that cause turned out to be embarrassingly unglamorous. George II's contribution to medical science was entirely involuntary and came at the cost of his life, but it was nevertheless real and valuable, giving physicians insights into aortic disease that would eventually help save other lives once surgical techniques advanced enough to actually treat these conditions. The bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone that a king who'd spent his life trying to control everything from military campaigns to palace protocols had made his most lasting impact not through his intentional actions but through the accidental documentation of his body's spectacular failure, turning his undignified death into a teachable moment for generations of medical students who would study the case and learn about the dangers of chronic straining and untreated cardiovascular disease. George II's death became instantly famous not because of anything remarkable about his reign but because dying while straining on a toilet is exactly the kind of humiliating end that people remember and repeat for centuries. The story spread through European courts within days, traveling from palace to coffeehouse to tavern as people whispered and laughed about the mighty King of England collapsing mid-bowel movement like some common drunk rather than expiring nobly in battle or peacefully in bed. His political enemies must have been delighted with the ammunition this gave them for mockery, and you can imagine the jokes that circulated about the king who literally died trying to take a shit. Historical accounts vary on how graphic they get with the details, with some sources delicately saying he died suddenly in his closet while others specify that he collapsed from straining at stool, but everyone understood what actually happened even if polite society tried to euphemize it for the history books. The medical community treated the autopsy findings with appropriate scientific seriousness, recognizing the valuable documentation of aortic dissection, but in popular culture George's death became a cautionary tale about constipation and proof that even absolute monarchs are subject to the same humiliating biological failures as everyone else. His grandson inherited the throne as George III and would rule for 60 years while slowly descending into madness from what was probably porphyria, but at least he managed to avoid dying in such an embarrassing fashion, though his later years of complete mental breakdown had their own indignities. Modern medical understanding has transformed George II's death from a humorous anecdote into a serious case study about the cardiovascular dangers of chronic straining, with doctors now warning elderly patients about the risks of bearing down too forcefully during bowel movements because they've seen the same mechanism kill people in emergency rooms when weakened aortas tear apart. The condition remains extremely lethal even with advanced medical care, with survival rates depending heavily on how quickly you can get emergency vascular surgery, and in 1760 there was absolutely nothing anyone could have done to save George once that dissection started. His death marked the end of an era in British history and ushered in the long troubled reign of George III, who would preside over the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars while fighting his own battles against mental illness. But George II himself would be remembered primarily for this one October morning when his cardiovascular system exploded from the pressure of straining on a toilet, ending the life of a king who'd conquered enemies on battlefields across Europe but couldn't conquer his own stubborn bowels, dying in the most humanizing and humiliating way possible and proving that crowns and empires mean nothing when your aorta decides it's had enough and tears itself apart.